The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the city's steel walkways slick and glistening under the neon glow of the docking bay. I adjusted my gloves as I stepped off the tram, trying to shake off the exhaustion from another double shift. All I wanted was a warm meal and a quiet bunk, but fate had other plans. The industrial sector smelled of scorched metal and ozone, a familiar scent that clung to my clothes like stubborn ash. Workers in dull exosuits trudged past with empty eyes, while the distant hum of repair drones echoed through the shipyard. I spotted her ahead of me, standing near the loading ramp like a sentinel. Ardira, the newest transfer to our engineering team, and easily the most enigmatic, Ardira was hard to miss. Her sharp silver eyes caught every flicker of movement, and though she wore the same grease-stained coveralls as the rest of us, there was an effortless poise in her stance that screamed anything but ordinary. The rumor was she'd transferred from a distant colony, but her accent and mannerisms felt otherworldly. I'd worked with plenty of off-world recruits before, but none like her. She moved with precise, almost predatory grace, and when she looked at you, it was as though she could read your pulse, your doubts, your hidden thoughts. I should have been intimidated, but I wasn't. I was intrigued. That morning, our shift began with a maintenance sweep of the excavation rigs stationed beyond the city wall. Ardira didn't say much on the transport ride, just sat by the window watching the barren dunes pass by with a distant expression. I had tried small talk once or twice before, but she always responded in clipped sentences. Polite but cool, the rigs were monstrous machines, their claw-like arms buried deep in the rocky crust, harvesting raw ore for the shipyards. It was a dirty, back-breaking job, but necessary. I was tasked with recalibrating the central control panel, while Ardira worked on the hydraulic stabilizers nearby. Hours passed in mechanical monotony. Occasionally I caught her stealing glances at me, not hostile, just intense. I brushed it off as my imagination. By mid-afternoon, we finally took a break, sitting on the edge of the platform with the rigs rumbling behind us. That's when I made the mistake. The comment that would ignite everything. I'd been trying to lighten the mood, to chip away at the quiet wall she kept between us. So I joked about another colleague, Lyra, the pilot who had a reputation for flirting with half the station. I teased that Lyra had probably set her sights on me next, just to get a reaction. To my surprise, Ardira's silver eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, her jaw tightening as she turned back toward the dunes. She said nothing, but her grip on her water canteen tightened until the metal creaked under her fingers. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. I chuckled, tossing in another remark about Lyra's persistence. That's when I caught it. A low, sharp exhale from Ardira, as though she were restraining herself. The silence that followed was heavier than the desert heat. I tried to backpedal to change the subject, but her gaze stayed locked on the horizon. There was something primal about her stillness that unsettled me, like a predator deciding whether or not to strike. We finished the shift in strained silence. I told myself I was imagining things, that she wasn't actually upset. But as we powered down the rigs and prepared to leave, I caught her reflection in the polished steel of the console. Her eyes were glowing faintly, a luminescent silver hue that wasn't human. The revelation hit me hard. She wasn't just from another colony. She wasn't human at all. Somehow that made everything I'd said earlier feel 100 times more reckless. On the tram back to the city, she finally spoke. "You find her attractive," she said flatly, not even looking at me. I stumbled over my words, trying to explain it was just a joke, but her tone didn't change. "There are lines you should not cross," she added quietly. It wasn't a threat, more like a warning. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. By the time we reached the station, night had settled in. The neon signs flickered against the mist, rising from the rain-soaked streets. I told myself tomorrow would be better, that I'd apologize properly, that things would go back to normal. But deep down, I sensed something brewing beneath Ardira's calm facade, something I had unknowingly unleashed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the next day would not be normal at all. When I finally reached my bunk that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her silver gaze staring back at me, colder than any starless void. The humming of the station's engines lulled me into a restless half-sleep. But even there I couldn't escape the thought. I had crossed some invisible line with her, and I wasn't ready for the fallout. Somewhere in the shadows of the city, Hadira was awake, watching the skyline from her quarters, fists clenched at her sides. I didn't know it then, but she was already fighting an instinct she could barely contain. The storm was coming. I just didn't know how soon it would break. The next morning dawned bright but carried a tense undercurrent that I couldn't quite explain. I arrived early at the maintenance bay, hoping to clear the air with Ardira before the rest of the crew showed up. She was already there, crouched beside a disassembled servo motor, her fingers moving with impossible precision as she realigned the delicate circuits. I cleared my throat softly to announce my presence, but she didn't look up. Her silver hair glinted faintly under the bay's fluorescent lights, and her expression was unreadable as ever. I offered a casual greeting, trying to sound light-hearted, but her silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, without lifting her gaze from the machinery, she said, "You talk too much about things that do not matter." Her voice was cool but not sharp, carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. Hurt, maybe, or restrained anger. I tried to apologize, explaining that the comments about Lyra had been just harmless banter, nothing serious. But Ardira's hands stilled on the servo motor, and she finally turned her head slightly toward me. Her eyes caught the overhead light in a way that made my chest tighten. It was as if there was liquid silver simmering beneath her irises. "Words are not harmless," she said. "Not when they come from someone you—" She stopped herself abruptly, returning to her work as though nothing had been said. The unfinished sentence lingered in the air between us, more powerful than if she had completed it. I wanted to press her, to ask what she'd meant, but something in her posture warned me not to. Instead, I focused on my own tasks, though I couldn't help but notice how the tension between us seemed to ripple out to the rest of the crew. We were assigned to oversee a routine systems diagnostic on the largest excavation rig 7, a hulking beast of a machine that could chew through stone like soft clay. As we made our way across the scaffolding toward the control tower, I caught glimpses of Ardira's clenched jaw, the way her shoulders stiffened when Lyra greeted us with her usual teasing grin. Lyra, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, joked about me saving her a seat on the shuttle home. I laughed awkwardly, mostly to diffuse the moment, but Ardira's eyes narrowed, and for a fraction of a second, her fingers flexed like she was resisting the urge to reach for something that wasn't there. The diagnostic went smoothly at first. I handled the programming updates, while Ardira inspected the servo locks on the stabilizers. Lyra came by to deliver a progress report from her team, leaning casually against the control panel as she chatted. That's when things began to shift. Ardira approached silently, her footsteps almost imperceptible on the grated floor. She stood just a little too close to Lyra, her gaze fixed on her like a hawk sizing up prey. Lyra, perhaps sensing the subtle hostility, straightened and excused herself with a nervous laugh. Once Lyra was gone, Ardira stepped up to the console beside me. "You encourage her," she said, her tone accusatory but quiet enough that no one else heard. I blinked at her, caught off guard. "Encourage her? She's just being friendly." Her expression didn't soften. "You do not understand the weight of attention," she replied, her voice low, almost a growl. I opened my mouth to argue, but was interrupted by a sharp beeping sound from the console. A diagnostic error had popped up on the main display. I leaned forward to address it, grateful for the distraction, but I felt Ardira's eyes on me the whole time, her presence looming like a storm cloud just over my shoulder. The error turned out to be a simple miscalibration, nothing dangerous, but my hands moved slower than usual under her watchful gaze. I could feel the tension rolling off her in waves, and I wondered if she even realized how palpable it was. The day dragged on with no further incidents, but the unease between us didn't fade. When our shift finally ended, I walked beside her toward the tram station, hoping to try again at easing the strain. "I really didn't mean anything by it," I said as we passed under the humming lights of the docking corridor. "You know that, right?" She didn't answer at first, then stopped walking entirely, forcing me to pause a step ahead of her. Her eyes glimmered faintly, betraying a hint of emotion that her stoic face tried to hide. "Some things cannot be joked about," she said quietly. "Where I come from, words like that have meaning. They are promises." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just nodded, trying to show I respected what she was saying, even if I didn't fully understand. We boarded the tram in silence, the hum of the engines filling the void between us. That night, as I returned to my quarters, I replayed our conversation in my head. There was something deeper going on with Ardira, something I couldn't quite grasp. I told myself I'd figure it out eventually. But part of me feared that whatever was beneath the surface was far more intense than I could imagine. Across the station, in her own quarters, Ardira stood in front of the small viewport that overlooked the city's neon-lit sprawl. Her fists were clenched at her sides, her breathing slow and deliberate as though she were fighting to stay composed. She whispered something in a language I couldn't understand, a vow to herself that whatever had been sparked inside her would not be ignored much longer. The air around her seemed to hum with restrained energy, a warning of the storm yet to come. The city outside glowed in ignorance, unaware that two people in its midst were on a collision course that would shatter more than just a control panel. The next day began with a strange stillness, as though the entire station was holding its breath. I arrived at the excavation site early again, but Ardira was already there, standing rigidly by the main console with her arms crossed. The air between us felt charged, carrying the weight of unspoken words from the previous night. She didn't greet me, didn't even glance my way as I set down my toolkit. I decided not to push things further and focused on the morning's checklist instead. The rigs hummed softly in the background, their colossal arms grinding against rock as they chewed through layers of hardened earth. When the rest of the crew arrived, including Lyra, I noticed the subtle shift in Ardira's stance. Her jaw clenched, and her eyes followed Lyra's every movement with a cold, calculating intensity. It was unsettling, like watching a hawk silently tracking a sparrow. Lyra, as usual, was in a bright mood. She greeted everyone with playful banter, including me, and even ruffled my hair in passing. I caught Ardira's narrowed gaze in my peripheral vision, but pretended not to notice. The first half of the day passed without incident, but the tension in the control tower was thick enough to taste. Ardira rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were curt, precise, stripped of any softness. Lyra, perhaps picking up on the icy atmosphere, grew quieter as the hours dragged on. Just before our lunch break, a sudden alarm blared across the control panels. I rushed to the main console to check the readings and saw a sharp spike in the excavation pressure gauge. If left unchecked, it could destabilize the entire rig. I started issuing commands to stabilize the system, typing quickly into the console when Lyra appeared at my side to help. Her shoulder brushed lightly against mine as she leaned in to read the diagnostics display. It was a harmless, fleeting contact, but it was enough to ignite something in Ardira. I didn't see it at first. I only realized something was wrong when the console screen flickered, the lights above us dimming momentarily. I turned to find Ardira standing rigidly a few steps away, her fists clenched so tightly that the veins in her forearms stood out like cords of steel. "Step back," she said, her voice low but carrying a dangerous edge that silenced everyone in the room. Lyra hesitated, confused, glancing at me as though I could explain what was happening. I opened my mouth to intervene, to calm Ardira down, but I never got the chance. Ardira stepped forward in a blur of motion, her right arm snapping out in a precise, devastating strike. The impact shattered the corner of the control panel with an ear-splitting crack, shards of glass and sparks flying in all directions. Lyra screamed and stumbled back as I instinctively shielded my face from the debris. The room fell into stunned silence. The only sound was the dying hum of the fractured console as it flickered and went dark. Taking the entire subsystem offline, Ardira stood there, breathing heavily, her fist still embedded in the wrecked panel. For a moment her eyes glowed faintly silver again, a haunting light that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Ardira," I shouted, rushing toward her, but she didn't move. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between fury and regret. Lyra, pale and shaken, backed toward the exit, her eyes wide with shock. The rest of the crew remained frozen, not daring to speak. I grabbed Ardira's arm gently, trying to coax her to step away from the destroyed console. Her skin was warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and beneath it I could feel a subtle vibration, like a suppressed current of energy threatening to break free. "This isn't you," I said quietly, hoping she'd hear me beneath the roar of whatever emotion had driven her to snap like that. Her gaze softened slightly, but her voice was rough when she replied, "You don't understand. I warned you about her. I wanted to argue, to tell her that her reaction was far beyond reasonable, but the look in her eyes stopped me. There was no malice there, only a raw, almost desperate emotion that I couldn't begin to untangle. The foreman arrived moments later, demanding an explanation for the destruction. I stepped in quickly, claiming a system overload had caused the panel to short-circuit. No one contradicted me, though I knew the lie was paper-thin. Ardira didn't say a word during the reprimand. She just stood there, silent and unyielding, her expression unreadable as always. When the shift ended, I tried to speak to her again, but she brushed past me without a glance, disappearing into the tram with her shoulders squared like a soldier marching into battle. That night, I sat in my quarters replaying the incident over and over, trying to figure out what had pushed her over the edge. Jealousy seemed too simple a word for what I'd seen in her eyes. Across the city, Ardira knelt in the dark of her room, her hands resting on her knees as she tried to steady her breathing. Her knuckles were raw, still marked by the shards of the shattered panel. She closed her eyes and whispered again in that alien tongue, her voice low but steady, a vow to regain control of herself. Outside her window, the neon-lit skyline gleamed, unaware that a secret war was brewing within her heart, a battle between her alien instincts and the human emotions she was only beginning to understand. The following morning, I awoke to a message blinking on my datapad, an urgent request to report to the foreman's office before the shift. My stomach tightened as I imagined the repercussions of yesterday's incident. I showered quickly, barely tasting my breakfast as my mind raced with excuses I could offer to shield Ardira. The foreman's office smelled of oil and stale coffee, the hum of the shipyard resonating faintly through the walls. He sat behind his desk with his arms crossed, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "The control panel didn't break itself," he said bluntly. Leaning forward as if to catch any lie I might conjure, I kept my expression neutral, sticking to the story I'd rehearsed. A sudden power surge had triggered the malfunction. He didn't look convinced, but eventually let me go with a stern warning, threatening to dock my pay if it happened again. Relief washed over me, but I knew I hadn't convinced him entirely. Outside, the morning air was cool, carrying the distant metallic tang of machinery. I spotted Ardira standing near the loading tram, her posture stiff, arms crossed as though bracing against some unseen wind. Her silver eyes flicked toward me when I approached, then back to the horizon. "We need to talk," I said quietly. She gave no response, only boarded the tram, leaving me no choice but to follow. We sat side by side in silence as the tram hummed along the rails, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels punctuating the heavy quiet between us. Halfway to the excavation site, she finally spoke. "I should not have done that." Her voice was low, heavy with something that sounded like shame, though her expression remained as stoic as ever. I turned to her, relieved to hear her admit it. "You think?" I tried to smile, hoping to lighten the tension, but it faded quickly when I saw the grim determination in her eyes. "You don't understand what I am," she said, her gaze fixed on the distant dunes outside the tram window. "Where I come from, we do not tolerate threats. We strike first. It is our way. I thought I had left that behind when I came here." Her words sank into me like lead. I wanted to say something comforting, but the weight of her confession left me speechless. She wasn't just a stranger from another world. She was a warrior trying to unlearn a lifetime of instincts that didn't belong here. When we arrived at Rig 7, the atmosphere among the crew was strained. Lyra avoided Ardira completely, keeping her distance, as though the shattered control panel still loomed between them like a warning. I could feel the tension ripple through every glance exchanged, every hushed whisper that followed us across the scaffolding. The day passed under a thick cloud of unease. Ardira worked with mechanical precision, never meeting my eyes, except when absolutely necessary. I tried to focus on my duties, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching someone teeter on the edge of something she couldn't control. Just after sunset, as the rigs were shutting down for the night, a system malfunction triggered an emergency lock on the excavation clause. We stayed behind to troubleshoot while the others left, the sky above darkening into a deep indigo scattered with distant stars. As I wrestled with a stubborn interface panel, I finally broke the silence. "You scared everyone yesterday, including me. I know you didn't mean to, but you have to see how it looked." She crouched beside me, her movements slow and deliberate, as though carefully measuring every word she was about to speak. "I have spent years hiding what I am," she said softly. "Here I am just another worker, but sometimes I forget myself." Her voice held a vulnerability I hadn't heard before, a hint of the struggle beneath her stoic mask. I glanced at her, noticing how the soft glow of the rig's warning lights caught in her silver eyes. "Then don't forget," I said gently. "You're more than what you were trained to be, I see that. Everyone else will too. Eventually." Her lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile, brief but real. For the first time in days, the tension between us seemed to ease, if only slightly. We managed to repair the malfunction together, the teamwork restoring a rhythm we'd almost lost. When we finally powered down the rig and packed up our tools, there was a calmness in her that hadn't been there before. On the tram ride back, the silence felt different, less like a wall and more like a truce. I caught her looking out the window, her reflection softened by the neon lights of the city as we approached the station. "You're not as fragile as you look," she said at last, her tone almost teasing. Most people would have walked away by now. I chuckled lightly, relieved to hear even a trace of humor in her voice. "Guess I'm stubborn that way." When we reached the station, she paused before heading to her quarters. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words sounding foreign on her tongue, but sincere. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my bunk, realizing that whatever had begun between us was far more complicated than I'd anticipated. She wasn't just my colleague anymore. Somewhere across the station, Ardira stood at her window, watching the stars with a contemplative expression. She touched the glass lightly, as though the distance between her world and this one could be crossed by the brush of her fingertips. For the first time since she arrived, the glow in her eyes softened, no longer the cold gleam of a warrior, but the quiet shimmer of someone learning what it meant to belong.